Okay, so now that we already have some experience from situation 1, we'll tackle situation 2, and I'll read it out loud again. So the situation is as follows. In the module Information Management, students work in groups of 3 to solve a case study. In the course of the semester, every group submits a number of deliverables as part of the case study. These deliverables are graded by the professor to determine the final grade for the group. Okay, so how can we map this description into an entity relationship model? What are your solutions and ideas? So maybe we can do this collectively this time. So what are definitely entities that you have identified? So somebody who contributes does not need to share the whole solution, so we do it piece by piece so everyone can participate maybe. So what entities? Start from left to right. So
student.
Okay, so you have a student as an entity type. Okay. You said groups. I'll write down group because we usually have entity types in a single, just so because we have the entity type group and we have all the groups as entities below, but we usually use the single version to describe them. So we don't say students, we say student and group, and so from the entity type students we have a lot of students under that, so derived from that. And did you want to say? Okay. Where should I put it? Is it in here? Okay. Deliverables. Oh, deliverable. I just said single. Does anyone have another entity type or something else? You and then Eric. Okay. So then I would add the professor here. Julius, you wanted to add the...
Another way. So I said the case study is an entity and the number of deliverables is an attribute of the
Okay, we can, as always, we can have different ways of modeling this. So you have a different approach. We can talk about this approach maybe after we finish this one. So it seems like you have a different one, and maybe we can edit when we completed the picture. We can see how we could have done it differently. Okay, so these are entity types. I think these are all there are, or do you have any more? Okay, so then let's move on to maybe giving them some attributes. There's no information, I think, about the attributes, but for completeness, a student will have an ID again and maybe a name. If we are really precise, then a name would also be first name and last name. So, but to save some space, later when we use it, when we create the database, we would have first and last name because as we will learn, we will have atomic values in databases, and first name, last name is not an atomic value. An atomic value would be to split them. And then to be correct, we would have first and last name here, but let's leave it at that. Maybe the group, I don't know if it has a group number, definitely in our case. So maybe that's also the primary key. And the deliverable maybe has at least a name or a description, and we also assign an ID to it. And the professor has, of course, also an ID, some kind of identification, something. Okay, so what are the relationships between those entity types? Yes, Dennis?
student is a member of a group. Member of.
member of, very hard word. Yeah.
And then the group submits the deliveries.
Submits. Yep.
And the deliverables are graded by the professor.
Okay, graded by. Okay, last but not least, the cardinalities. We were still missing them. What? Yeah, Dennis, you can.
3 students in one group.
So where do I put the 3?
By the student.
So that would mean one group has 3 students, and 3 students have maximum of 1 group. So each of those 3 has 1 group. Yeah. Okay, we could write it this way. So the very correct one, in this case, this would be equivalent to 3.3. This means only 3. We can write the short version. That's fine. And this is also equivalent to 1.1, but this is the shorter version. As the same manner, we can write n or 1 as the abbreviation. But this is okay. This means 3 to 1, 1 to 3, as it is described in the situation. Okay. What about the others? Yes, Eric.
One group submits n deliverables.
So one group submits any number of deliverables. Here doesn't say how many. And the other way around, we would read it, a number or any number of deliverables is submitted by one group. This means that one deliverable always belongs to exactly one group. Okay, and then the last one. Yeah, or maybe Clara?
One professor graded n deliverables.
Yeah, so there's always one professor grades one any number of deliverables, and any number of deliverables are only graded by one professor. Okay, this is, yeah?
Maybe we could add some attributes as the grade for the deliverables
Mm-hmm.
and the final grade for the group, or maybe for the student.
Let's stick to the first one you mentioned. So you want to add the grade for the delivery. Where would you put that?
To the delivery.
So you would put the grade here as an attribute. Grade. Okay, and
Then we have the final grant. It's the final grant for the group, but it's also the final grant for the student.
so where would you put the final grade in this case?
To the group.
So if we, I don't know what the text says, as part of the case study, blah blah, are graded to determine the final grade for the group. So if it's the group, then we could say, okay, let's, I'll put it down. It's called a final grade. We can maybe discuss a way how we could model this differently. So this would at least ensure that we have an attribute final grade for the group, and we have grades for the deliverables. Yeah. So maybe a remark from my side, what we could have done. So there can be more than one relationship between 2 entity types. So we could have said, okay, we actually have another one here, which is the deliverables determine the grade. Well, this is not the grade, but we could have a relationship for that. It's basically the same as if we wrote the grade directly to the group in terms of implementation later on. So we won't do it here, but we could have different relationships between the same entity types. In this case, it wouldn't make much sense because the deliverable doesn't determine the group. It would determine the final grade of the group, but then we would have to model the grade as an object and stuff like that. So this wouldn't make any sense here. So it might make perfect sense if we do it like this. Does anyone have a suggestion for maybe if we have a deliverable graded by professor, we could also have put the grade on the relationship. That doesn't make a difference in the modeling later on, since we have we learned that a 1 to n relationship will result in an attribute in that table anyway. So it will be equivalent, but it will make it more clear that it's actually the grade comes from the relationship between deliverable and professor who grades it. So we could model it this. It would be a little bit more precise in terms of semantics. And the final result would still be that the grade will not later be a part of the deliverable when we talk about a database. So you had a different approach. Let me know in which direction it goes. Maybe I want to add one more thing. It was about the case study, right? You wanted to model. Okay, let's start at the first. So you would have an attribute called for the student called what? But that's not an attribute in this sense. So an attribute is like a characteristic a student has. A student doesn't have a characteristic 3 persons. Well, it wouldn't make any sense. Okay, you have student group, and then you could have an attribute number of students. That's what you could, yeah. And you could say it's always 3. Okay, so that's basically this, and you say, okay, number of students.
Yeah, student and group is in my case one entity.
So you have those two merged together, student group. Yeah.
It's a fixed number, 3 persons only, so why should I split it?
Well, if you're not concerned with each individual student in some manner, it might make sense. Let's give it a try. So you have student group. Yeah, let's call that number of students. I have to think it through modeling it. Then you have.
With the relationship, solve the case study.
So you have case study.
Case study is
So student group solves case study. Case study. Yeah, just write grades. That's a verb. Okay. That's it? So where do you put the grade actually? So there's the grade for each deliverable. So you in this case you have the case study, but you don't have the deliverables. You couldn't model that you have deliverables that receive a grade. At least I don't see it. So you could say, okay, there's a grade here, but this would apply for the whole case study then.
not only for the
Well, you could say that the professor, since you model case study and the case study is made of the deliverables, you cannot say that each of those deliverables receives a grade. You can only say, okay, the case study receives one grade. So this is too aggregated at this point. So we actually want to model the deliverables which determine the final group of the final grade of the group, and that would be the grade for the case study. So yours would be too aggregated already, not detailed enough. So that's why I would prefer this one. And one remark maybe, so the professor himself does not really play a role other than grading it. So if you didn't have the professor and the relationship grades the deliverable, it would still be valid, because this is basically just, you could also interpret the information professor grades deliverable as a side note, where does the grade come from, and you just simply put in the grade. So if you just want to manage that data, you could simply say, okay, there's a grade, and we know this is coming from the professor, and we leave all this out. This would also be possible, especially if we don't need to model or manage data about the professor at any point. So then they would make it simpler, and we could actually erase this whole part, and then it would still be modeling the situation, but it would take the last part that the professor is involved as a side note, which is not relevant to our system. So the question is the professor relevant to the system, and does he need to be modeled, or is he or she not? If it's not the case, then we wipe out the professor at this case.